right, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. This research paper has been more than a year in the making, and I'm so proud that today we finally published the full report. And a big thanks to Sarah Stonbely, who will be on stage in just a moment to present her findings. Also, I want to thank Heather Bryant, who helped edit the report and designed it, went through many iterations with us. And I also want to thank everyone who was gracious enough to give Sarah time so she could interview you for the paper. Your stories are really what made this successful and helped us to identify 6 different models of collaboration. This is the fourth thing that the center has done based around collaborative journalism, and we hope it's the beginning of many more to come. Last year, several of you were at our collaborative journalism summit. After that, we were fortunate to give out $42,000 in grants to 6 rather different reporting projects across the country. We've recently launched collaborativejournalism.org, which we hope will be a hub of resources, case studies. And now today we are releasing our full paper on comparing different models of collaborative journalism. So with that being said, I would like to welcome the author of the report to the stage, Sarah Stonbely.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks for everyone for being here. On behalf of the Center for Cooperative Media, as well as the School of Communication and Media here at Montclair State, I welcome you and I thank you for your interest in this important topic. As Stephanie alluded, this research began with the germ of an idea, and it was really Stephanie who sensed a lot of interest in collaborative journalism sort of out there in the field. And we decided to organize the summit on collective journalism. And as we were planning, Stephanie's instincts were confirmed. The Collaborative Journalism Summit last May, which some of you attended, was successful beyond our expectations. There's a lot of excitement and positivity, and more than one person noted that it was nice to attend a journalism conference that was more success stories than doom and gloom. Sorry, one second. At that conference, I presented our initial matrix of different models of collaborative journalism, and I was really glad and not a little bit relieved that they held up when applied to the many different examples of collaborative journalism that we discussed at the summit. What followed, as Stephanie mentioned, was several months of intensive research, including interviews, reading, analysis, and discussion, which has finally culminated in the report that we are here to discuss. Before getting into the models in the matrix, I'd just like to talk briefly about sort of the big picture context of collaborative journalism. Of course, it is not new. In fact, it dates all the way back to the 19th century and the advent of the wires. The Associated Press was, in fact, one of the very earliest collaborative efforts. The joint operating agreements that many newspapers had in the 1970s and 80s were also collaborations. And that sort of back office arrangement is highlighted in one of the models that I'll discuss shortly. In the 1990s, organizations such as New America Media were partnering ethnic outlets with legacy outlets to share expertise and resources. And in the early 2000s, Jan Schaefer's JLab was forward thinking when they worked with Knight Foundation to foster a number of collaborations, some of which continue today. And of course, Josh Stern's now at Democracy Fund has been talking up collaborative journalism for years. So it's not new. But what is new is the depth and the breadth of journalistic collaboration and the popularity the practice has gained and the critical mass that's being achieved. For example, one statistic that I highlight in the report is that as of 2017, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has put nearly $32 million into fostering 29 collaborative journalism projects, and that number is still growing. So how do we find collaborative journalism? Collaborative journalism in the report is defined as a cooperative arrangement between two, can be formal or informal, between two or more news and information organizations, which aim to supplement each organization's resources and maximize the impact of the content produced. We distinguish collaborative journalism here from citizen, participatory, engaged, public. of journalism that solicit information from the public or consider interaction with the public to be a cornerstone practice. Though many collaborations do indeed have an engaged element. We also situate collaborative journalism, at least the type we're discussing here, squarely in and between newsrooms. Although we do plan to explore collaborations between newsrooms and other types of organizations, such as tech and civic organizations, in the future. So we've identified two of what we think are the most important variables of collaborative journalism models, and those are duration and degree of integration among partner organizations. And then you can see here that as both increase, required also increases. The matrix, which I know is very small here, and you can see it in more detail or more closely on page 21 of the report, shows these same variables. So you have duration on the horizontal axis in the one-time and finite projects, and then the ongoing or open-ended projects. Duration on the vertical axis, so starting with creating content separately and sharing it, working together to create content, and then finally at the highest level of integration, organizations are integrated at the level of the organization, so they're sharing data and resources at that level. This results in 6 models of collaborative journalism, which I'll discuss briefly. So temporary and separate, temporary and co-creating, and then ongoing and separate, ongoing and co-creating, ongoing and integrated. And I will just note that the number of examples here is somewhat arbitrary, although we do try to reflect sort of the more common and less common models as they're practiced in the field. So let me just discuss each really briefly, and there's much more detail in the report, as you'll see. Model features collaborations where partners work together on one-time or finite project, and they're creating content separately. So the content may be aggregated for presentation in one place, such as the program's website, or they may be presented across different platforms, on partners' platforms or across media. Some projects that fall under this model use a sort of decentralized, very laissez-faire approach to content creation, while others have specific guidelines for what should be produced by participating organizations. The projects where those decisions are not made in advance, one way or the other, do tend to run into trouble. A common benefit of these types of projects is that especially when organizations of different sizes partner together, these organizations or contributors gain much greater visibility than they would have had otherwise. Also, when collaborations in this model are around specific issues, such as a local river or homelessness, as 2 of the examples we looked at, they are able to leverage contributor and community passions around these issues. One common cost or tension of this model can be quality control, because it's very sort of atomized across organizations. So we looked at some great examples in this temporary and separate model, including One River, Many Stories, led by the University of Minnesota Duluth, the San Francisco Homeless Project, and New America Media's Surging Seas, all of which you can read more about in the report. The next is the temporary and co-creating model. Finite collaborations where partners create content together. These are necessarily closer and more coordinated projects than those in which participants produce content separately, and they therefore require more resources, at least during some stages. When partners work together to create content, of course, there's the potential for conflicting priorities at different newsrooms, but this tension can be mitigated in different ways, including by general excitement about the topic, by good project management, or by a high level of rapport. Examples in this model tend to be investigative or accountability pieces, which was an interesting finding, I thought. So the examples we looked at include Electionland, American Dream about the mall formerly known as Xanadu here in New Jersey, and Voting Block, also here in New Jersey. So all of these graphics, as well as the matrix, are also available in the report as well. Temporary and integrated projects are those projects that are finite, but where the partnering organizations are sharing resources at the level of the organization. So when they share this kind of, when they have this level of integration, there's obviously going to be close coordination and regular contact for the duration of the project. Perhaps the best example of this type of collaboration to date is the Panama Papers, where participating organizations all had access to the same data and proprietary software. They were working together to sort through it, but writing different stories that were unique to the outlet that produced them and publishing on many different sites. When organizations are highly integrated for a collaboration, it generally requires buy-in from all levels. But the payoff is great, right? Working together in this way allows newsrooms to produce content they would never have been able to produce on their own. Both the temporary and integrated and the ongoing and integrated, which I'll discuss in a moment, are the least common types of collaboration, perhaps because they require an intimate relationship among outlets that are normally competitors. Other examples that we looked at include First Draft's Crosscheck, a collaboration between ProPublica, WBEZ's Chicago's This American Life, and NPR's Planet Money on a hedge fund called Magnetar, which ended its practices in the early 2000s. So again, just not a ton of examples of this type of model out there yet. So moving on now to the ongoing collaborations. The ongoing and separate model is where is an open-ended collaboration where organizations work together to create content. And this includes some of the oldest known collaborations, the wires that I mentioned earlier, as well as some of the contemporary sharing arrangements, such as Gannett's USA Today network and CNN also fall into this model. Smaller news organizations are using it too, though. The common thread in these projects is that organizations reap the benefits of content sharing while maintaining a high level of autonomy and editorial independence. A local ongoing and separate collaboration that we looked at in the report is between Charlottesville Tomorrow and the Daily Progress, both in Charlottesville, Virginia. And here, the Charlottesville Tomorrow began as a newsletter focused on education issues, and the Daily Progress is the area's legacy print newspaper. The Progress began to print some of Charlottesville Tomorrow's education stories when the newsroom was downsized, and now, hundreds of stories later, they're still involved in a collaboration that's been mutually beneficial. For Charlottesville Tomorrow, so it's obvious that the Daily Progress gets content that they would have never had. For Charlottesville Tomorrow, it gives them a seal of credibility being printed in the Daily Progress. Perhaps surprisingly, I was surprised, many of these collaborations begin informally and without a contract and are codified as they mature. This type of collaboration, ongoing and separate, is the most commonly practiced today, both in terms of the number of organizations involved and the geographic area reached by such projects. Other examples in the report include Fronteras and Cal Matters. The next model, ongoing and co-creating. So again, ongoing project. Co-creating means they're producing the content together. Usually these types of collaborations have regular editorial meetings or calls, and the most successful in this model have a project manager who oversees the collaboration and facilitates sharing and manages competing priorities. Collaborations in this model see benefits such as efficiencies created by letting one reporter cover a press conference, where all of the partners may have been sending a reporter. Now just one reporter goes and reports back to the whole collaboration, or centralizing editing tasks that newsrooms may have been doing individually. This model also allows reporters to gain insights from other geographical locations or topic areas that they wouldn't have had access to working alone, as in NPR's collaborative coverage project, with which Bruce Auster will speak about more in a moment. While we were researching collaborations in this model, we found several that began with a grant, usually from Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And then they decided to continue after the grant ended by self-funding. They agreed upon an amount that each partner would pay, and that went toward paying for the collaboration manager and for other resources. And we state in the report that this is a promising path forward for collaborations that begin with an initial grant and want to continue after. So the final model is ongoing and integrated, which again, ongoing collaboration, where organizations are sharing resources at the level of the organization. not yet very common, but we do see it as a really innovative way of addressing some of the challenges of the local media landscape. The few examples that we looked at in the report are similar in structure. They are made up of local outlets that operate independently, but are completely integrated for some aspect of their back office services. So this means that editorial hiring and promotion decisions are made completely independently, but that they share an ad network, a proprietary platform, or accounting services, or sometimes all three. So the examples we look at in the report are the Tap Into network of digital native local sites here in New Jersey, which is a collaboration between 7 public radio stations in Southeast Alaska. Collaborations using this model find that sharing back office services creates efficiencies and allows them to hire professionals to do this work, which are usually not the strong suit of journalists. They also gain some of the benefits of being part of a collaborative, such as working together on big stories or learning by observing each other's workflows. Ongoing and integrated collaborations are not for the faint of heart. You have to be willing to cede control of major aspects of the operation, but those who have taken the plunge do find that the benefits outweigh the costs. So while these 6 models for categorizing all of the collaborative projects we discuss, there were some projects that blurred the lines or changed models as the project progressed, thus our little friend the chameleon up here. So for example, the Harvest collaboration between several public outlets across the Midwest is categorized as ongoing and co-creating, but it shades into ongoing and integrated because they share several resources at the organizational level. So where that happens in the report, we note that. Likewise, the Detroit Journalism Cooperative began as temporary and separate, but since morphed into an ongoing and co-creating model. So despite these examples, we do think that the matrix will be useful, we hope, to journalists, editors, scholars, and funders alike who want to know what they may be getting into if they're considering a collaboration, or when they're considering funding a collaboration. We've distilled a lot of this information and put it on the website we've created to house the white paper materials, so I invite you to check it out. And with that, I will introduce our panel, who will discuss, take these concepts and ideas and bring them into the real world and into real life with the collaborations that they all work on. So our moderator will be the Center's director, Stefanie Murray. I would like to invite up Bruce Auster of NPR's Collaborative Journalism Network. From 2008 to 2015, Bruce was NPR's senior security editor, where he directed NPR's coverage of international security issues from Washington. For 5 years before that, he was the senior supervising editor of NPR's Morning Edition. In that role, he defined the editorial agenda for the show, identifying subject stories Morning Edition should be covering, and then helping bring those stories to the air. So we can all tell him how much we love Morning Edition later when we talk to him after the panel. Before joining NPR, Auster spent 16 years as reporter and editor at U.S. News and World Report. There, among other things, he was the magazine's Pentagon correspondent for 5 years, covering stories from the first Gulf War, Clinton administration. Jean Friedman-Rudovsky is the project editor of Solution Journalism Network's Reentry Project in Philadelphia. From 2006 to 2013, Jean lived in La Paz, where she was a reporter for Time magazine. She's also a contributing editor to Vice magazine, and her writing has been published in the New York Times, Cosmopolitan, Science, Vice, Foreign Policy, Village Voice Media, Marie Claire, and the Telegraph Saturday magazine, among others. She covers topics related to social justice and reports on the lives of people and communities whose voices are underrepresented in mainstream media. She is also in the process of writing a book titled Disruptors: Women's Resistance to Injustice from Across the Globe. And we have Erica Anderson, Partnerships Manager at Google News Lab. There, she's worked on projects such as Journalism 360, in which she built a global network of immersive journalists. She has also trained hundreds of editors to fly drones via Pointer's drone journalism camps. She regularly leads industry conversations on topics such as AI in the newsroom and trust in media. Before Google, Erica was headed news partnerships for Twitter. As the company's first news industry hire, she spearheaded its nascent journalism efforts, creating projects such as Twitter for newsrooms, satellite long codes so journalists could tweet from war zones, and identifying the data miner for News Initiative. Prior to Twitter, Erica had the opportunity to work for Katie Couric at CBS Evening News, supporting Katie's instincts that social would be big, providing her with support to lean into the new medium, integrating Twitter on the broadcast, utilizing blogs for interview research, and much more. And we are so pleased to welcome all of them here today.
Let's take my picture off.
There we go.
Where would you like to sit?
Yeah, I'll sit down here. My mic works, it appears. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. We really, really appreciate it. Thanks for making the trip here from Washington and Philadelphia and New York City. It's wonderful to have you in our beautiful new building here on the campus of Montclair State University. And Sarah, your presentation was great. Thank you for all the work that you've done in this. And so I want to start with Bruce and then go to Jean and Erica. Before we get into some questions, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about how you approach collaboration in your work and why it's important to you.
Sure, happy to do it, and glad to see people out here who are interested in figuring out ways that journalists can work together, because that's really what this is about. And in the end, it's about figuring out how we tell better stories and keep people informed. You know, what I'm doing now is an offshoot of what I've done my whole career. I started as a news magazine writer where, as an early journalist, as a young journalist coming up, I was always the tagline at the end of a story. Some big shot would write the story, but they would get files from people like me who would contribute. And so working as a team was something that I started my career with. So when you get to a place like NPR, where there's only one person's voice on the radio, you're working against a slightly different culture. I mean, the person who is the lead reporter is the star. And so I worked at Morning Edition, and I worked, you know, with the hosts, Steve Inskeep, Renee Montaigne. I was editor, and that is a certain kind of culture. Well, collaboration expands, and it exists as a challenge even within an organization like NPR. And as I moved across the organization, you're always looking for ways to get different people on different beats at different parts of the organization to learn how to work with each other and to share information. So now what we're trying to do is take it another step. I don't know all the stations that folks listen to who are here, who are listening or paying attention to this panel, but we have 200 newsrooms across the country, and we have this notion that wouldn't it be great if all those newsrooms knew what each other was thinking and doing. And so the task is to say, how can we become an even better network? How can we take the knowledge that exists in one part of our system and make sure it's shared with people in the other parts of the system so that we tell better stories for the audience? And that's what we're working on now.
That's such a great point, knowing what all the other newsrooms are working on. That's been a key challenge for a lot of large news organizations. Jean.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for coming. So my name is Jean Friedman-Rudovsky, and I'm the project editor of the Reentry Project, which is one of the sort of case studies that Sarah looks at in her report. And what we are is we are a group of 15 newsrooms in Philadelphia, including, you know, sort of the big guys in the area, WHYY, Philadelphia Inquirer, Daily News, Philly.com, and a variety of new and community and ethnic media in the city. And we have come together. We started at the end of last year and are going through this year and now going into the next year, looking at the issue of prisoner reentry from a solutions-oriented perspective. So this project was kind of conceived of when I was working with the Solutions Journalism Network, which some of you may know is an organization dedicated to sort of fostering and facilitating the ability of journalists to do critical reporting on responses to social problems rather than just the problems themselves. So we're a group of 15 newsrooms that do, dedicated reporting on reentry over the course of the year, and a lot of community engagement on the issue. And so, we are, I would say, in the scheme that Sarah put up, we're temporary and separate, although there is some co-creation that happens, both in terms of there's, been joint reporting, cross-newsroom reporting that's going on, and we have sort of a collective pot of money that any partner can apply to use for anything kind of related to the project, and then everyone else in the group decides whether they should get that allotment or not. And I actually don't have a vote. I facilitate those funding calls, but it's all, essentially their competitors deciding whether they should get the resources. So it's been a really fun project. It comes from a grant from the Knight Foundation, and we actually recently, just last week, got a grant from the Lenfest Institute, which is a new institute in Philadelphia dedicated to improving local journalism in Philly and around the country. And so we will be moving into 2018. And the exciting thing about that is sort of the vision that we put forward in our grant proposal was moving this in some ways to become, an ongoing co-creating, even though we didn't use these words, ongoing co-creating space of essentially establishing a permanent independent hub for solutions-oriented collaborative reporting in Philadelphia that, is open to any newsroom in the area. And our, next topic of focus is still to be determined. So we're, in terms of fundraising, sort of part of the way there with the Lenfest grant to pursue that bigger vision. We certainly need a little bit more, but that's the direction that we're heading.
Right. And Solutions Journalism Network has been a great partner of ours in New Jersey, as has the Google News Lab. So Erica, tell us a little bit about your view.
Yeah, well, it's good to be here. Thank you for having us. Thanks for your presentation.
Yeah.
I come to this from the perspective of, I work at the Google News Lab. Google News Lab started 2 years ago as Google's effort to build the future of journalism. That's a big, ambitious effort, and we certainly couldn't do that alone, but we're a lot of people, about 15, 20 people inside the company who are former journalists, who felt like we needed a dedicated effort to look at Google technology and resources and figure out how to apply that to editorial and to help newsrooms around the world. So coming to the collaborative journalism space from that vantage point, a big thing that we look at is one of our biggest areas of focus is trust and verification. How can we help to build, what is our role in facilitating and convening partners, bringing technology to the table to help improve fact-checking, quelling misinformation, helping journalists to do their jobs more efficiently. And so through that vantage point, we've gotten very involved in First Draft Coalition Partner Network, which we are a proud founding member of about 2 years ago. We're behind and collaborated with ProPublica and First Draft Univision on election land. That was a really big project we were a part of. Documenting Hate is another big kind of initiative that's going on right now that's looking at using Google data and information to track hate crimes across the United States so that journalists can have access to that. So I think generally like the future of journalism is going to be built right now as the constraints in the industry are occurring through collaborations like this and through coming up with new models, new workflows, new strategies. And as a tech company, like being at the table is critical for us to be learning alongside and getting ideas. And frankly, after these big projects end, coming back and talking to our engineers and our executives about what we've learned so that we can better understand the role that Google plays in terms of people finding quality journalism.
Absolutely. So Bruce, let's start with you a question. So Sarah identified the collaborative coverage project as in the report. And one of the things that she talked about, especially when you're looking at ongoing and co-creating, that gets a little higher up the commitment level.
We are so committed.
So as the project manager and the editor, can you talk a little bit about what's required to keep a project like that running smoothly from the internal and external issues, workflow, et cetera?
Sure. And we talk a lot about how, the whole role of an editor has changed. And you can call it whatever you want. You can call it an editor or project manager. There are a lot of labels for it, but in the end, you're basically trying to get a lot of different people who have different interests to work and pull in the same direction, and to define exactly what we're talking about here, so you have some sense of this. For any of you who listen to NPR, you will hear the sort of national or international correspondents. You will hear the hosts of the programs, but a lot of times what you also hear are reporters from out in the country. And the question sometimes for us is what is our relationship? What is the relationship between headquarters in Washington and those? I mean, there are literally 1,800 journalists who work at member stations across the country. Not all of them are reporters, but there's a lot of reporters out there. And you hear some of them on the air. And some of them are really good, and some of them are young and up and coming, and some of them will one day be stars on NPR. Part of the trick is to figure out who's who and who's good at what. We have had a system for a long time that brought some of those voices to our audiences, but maybe didn't take full advantage, maybe wasn't systematic enough. And so our collaborative project, and it's going even beyond what I'm going to talk about right now, but at a basic level, we're just trying to figure out how do we take the best of what these folks are doing and integrate it more with what people are thinking about in Washington. And so imagine having NPR reporters on phone calls, conference calls, in communication with member station reporters all over the country who have the same expertise. And it turns out that there are a lot of station reporters who are really good on energy environment. There are a lot of really good reporters on criminal justice. There are a lot of really good reporters on military and veterans affairs. And so the trick was, how do you convene them? Because it turns out that all of them are doing stories and all of them are reporting stuff, and some of it gets on their local station and you never hear it if you don't live where they are. And some of it makes its way to the national air, and none of them knew each other. And so now we've created a project in which these people are talking. We had a call today that I missed because I was kind of coming over here. But and somebody else ran it. But we had a whole bunch of military and veterans reporters on the phone today planning stories that you will hear. And that didn't used to happen. And it seems sort of obvious that this would be a good way to do it, but we weren't built that way. And so you have to structure your organization in a way that makes these things happen. And what it takes oftentimes is an editor who can hear ideas and how a good idea in one part of the country connects to a good idea in another, and then bring that together.
Yeah. Was it hard convincing those editors to, allow the reporters to join in this and dedicate time?
Yes, I mean, it's a really interesting question, because one of the things you have to do is you have to align different interests. And you can imagine that if you're running a station in San Diego or in the Midwest somewhere, that you also have a local audience, and you have needs that have to be fulfilled, and you have a small newsroom, and you don't have a lot of people who you can spare. And so there's a sort of tug of war between, do I take care of my local needs, or do I take care of national NPR? And the trick is to find some common ground, some value for both, so that it's worth their time to give up their reporter to just talk with a bunch of other reporters on the same topic. And maybe there won't be a story that comes back to you, but that's still worth your time. It's an investment in that person. And so that's the kind of thing we're doing. And, to your question, the role of the editor is to be the diplomat and find ways to make that work, and to then at the end of it show that you got something more by participating than you would have if you had done it the old way.
Yep, and sometimes that takes time.
It takes a lot of time.
And Jean, so we talked about the Reentry Project, and you explained a little bit in your opening, and that was temporary and separate?
Separate,
Separate,
right
yeah.
but it's transitioning into another model, right?
The lizard,
Yeah.
the chameleon.
Exactly.
Yeah, the
We're
chameleon.
chameleon.
So one of the common challenges of this type of collaboration is that outlets that normally would compete with each other, this is a little different than what Bruce is talking about, the NPR affiliates in different stations. These are organizations that are not connected in any way, and they compete. So how do you manage that, and how did you get them to the point where they were willing to work together?
It's funny. So the way that this started, I am originally from Philadelphia. I was abroad reporting for many years, and I moved back a couple of years ago. And Solutions Journalism Network hired me in sort of what they considered a pilot project, if they wanted to create chapters or sort of communities in different cities, with someone spearheading this effort to just kind of create community amongst journalists who shared the solutions-oriented approach. And it was a very vague mission, and the idea was, do some workshops, do some trainings. So I started getting together with the few journalists that I knew in town to talk about how could we make it be a little bit more interesting than people just talking about solutions journalism. And this one reporter that I met with, who's been at the Inquirer for 30 years, said, why don't we do a collaborative project where we get all the local newsrooms together doing solutions-oriented reporting around one specific topic? And I said, that's a great idea. She said, what about reentry from prison? It was something, she's an employment beat reporter. It was something she was personally interested in. I said, that sounds fantastic. She didn't know that I had done reporting on the issue previously, but I saw that it had potential in the sense that it could be covered from a variety of beats without tons of overlap. There's not a whole lot of scoops in reentry, so you can kind of mitigate the competitiveness that sometimes is inherent in our profession. So I started just literally sort of one by one going to the different outlets in Philadelphia, getting intros to the top folks and saying, hey, here's this idea, what do you think of it? And from the beginning, almost every person said, yep, we're in. WHYY, for example, took a little bit more time, not because they weren't interested, but they wanted to make sure that if they joined on, they would have, the staff and resources to dedicate to it.
You were talking to executives. You want
exactly. I was talking to, that time the editor-in-chief of the Inquirer, the person who was the editor-in-chief of Philadelphia Magazine, the president of WURD, who's the Black Talk radio station in Philly. So getting sort of buy-in from the top. And I was, surprised, but very encouraged. And then from that point forward, once I kind of had that initial, yeah, sounds like a good idea, I brought together kind of a planning committee of about 7 of those outlets, I guess. And they built it, really, right? So it wasn't me who designed it. It was me along with a group of people who were saying, here's what's going to work for us. Here's what's not going to work for us. They were very clear that what later became my position as project editor, it should be more sort of manager or director. They didn't want someone external doing line edits on stories. They didn't want that sort of intrusion, but they wanted something, they wanted to be able to feel like they were working as a team towards, kind of a larger goal, which is increasing awareness around this issue that's very important for Philadelphia because we have the highest incarceration rate of the 10 largest cities in the United States. And so I think that's what helped us address the competitive stuff, as people just felt from the beginning, this is worthy, we've been competitors for a long time, why not we all try coming together and working on this one, unique project.
It's so interesting that everyone immediately said yes when you approach them. I mean, I feel like that is something, the larger sort of in the ether type of thing about collaboration right now.
Well, the topic.
And the topic
They
too.
could buy into the topic.
Yeah.
That's something we found too. In this research.
Yeah,
Really
the topic
important.
is compelling for them. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it seems more natural for news organizations to work with other news organizations because we're in the same field, but partnering with a tech company, especially one of the largest ones in the world, probably seems a little bit more of a stretch for some news organizations. So Erica, you spent a lot of time at Twitter doing news partnerships, of course, and now with your time at Google and the News Lab. For the ones that you've been involved in, that Google News Lab has been involved in, like Election Land and working with First Draft, how do those typically from your end get initiated? And then how do you decide at Google where it makes sense for you to partner?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm just sitting here thinking about my days working at CBS News and how I feel like the competition is like a thing of a different generation. I mean, certainly like the big three, CBS, the broadcasters, like we all know, and AP and UPI, like the way they used to compete for the breaking news story, but Twitter disrupted that. I mean, Twitter took away no one's competing for the scoop anymore. I mean, certainly there are some big scoops, especially we saw last year in the elections, really big scoops about Trump's taxes and other things that great investigative journalists found. But I do feel like we're in a different era where collaboration is so important. And for us, like, I have a lot of brilliant teammates who aren't up here today. Simon Rogers, Olivia Ma, people who have, a lot of relationships. We have a lot of relationships. We come from the news side, so we speak the language. We understand the challenges. And when I think about First Draft or Electionland, like Electionland was a conversation that started between Scott Klein at ProPublica and Simon Rogers and Claire Wardle, and just 3 people talking, we should do this. There's this need to, can we build a pop-up newsroom around a specific topic of debunking misinformation and issues happening at the polls? Can we bring in students? Can we bring in different technology from, Google technology, Google Trends, to Data Miner, to CrowdTangle, Slack, and really like just imagine a future newsroom where people are working around a single topic, but not from the same organizations. And, I think people are willing to take risks together right now to figure out what the future looks like. And so that's a sweet spot for the News Lab, because we're all about collaboration and trying to use Google's technology and resources for figuring things out. So I don't know, we go where for me personally, like there's like great ideas and great energy and things we haven't done before where we could really have impact, because for us as a big company, it's about impact. And I think Electionland led to Full Fact in the UK, which led to Crosscheck, which are all projects we've been involved in. Now we look ahead to 2018. What's the next iteration of this look like? How can we have more impact on the things that journalists are debunking? How does that feed back into platforms such as us and such as Facebook and Twitter? So just the relationship between platforms and publishers is so important. So these kinds of projects provide a great opportunity for us to work together.
I was just going to say, one of the, I think, important insights there is the idea that one thing leads to another, that you can't just view any one project as sort of an end in itself, because, they all have something that worked about them and they all have something that wasn't quite what you'd hoped for. But the trick is to like take Electionland, say, and then turn it into, some part of it becomes something else, and so forth and so on, so that each time you're moving to another level, because these things work. You learn stuff if you have a collaboration, if you work with a team. I mean, the first time you do it, it's always bumpy. There's relationship kind of things where you have to learn how to work together. And if at the end of that, all you do is go on to something completely different without building on that, then you don't get as far as you could. You need to go back and work with those people again on something different and learn from the first time.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And talk about in detail what didn't work. Like, what made you uncomfortable last time?
Things don't
Why
work.
didn't this work? Things won't work. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was Jennifer Preston last week or a couple weeks ago at the Google News Lab Summit who said, we have a moment now. We really do have a moment where it feels like many in our industry are interested in working in the public's interest together rather than in our own interest only. But I'm curious from your perspectives too, if there's any difference in media. I mean, we all work together because this is how we are built, and we manage collaborations in New Jersey, and we're all journalists or former journalists. But at different parts of the country, folks really don't think like that. I mean, I remember we were at an event earlier this year where Jim Schachter from WNYC, great partner of ours, was on a panel, and one of the members of his panel said something like, I would never work with another organization. She was really surprised, and why would you ever do that? And I was surprised, she was surprised. So do you see differences in types of media or parts of the country? Yeah.
I certainly have, in that, so we have 15 member organizations, no TV stations. We approached the.
It was a TV
was
station.
yeah.
She was, yeah, that's fine.
And your comment about being a TV station as well. I do think there is still some of that mentality. The couple of TV stations that we approached, one, it was clear they were actually uncomfortable with the topic and they didn't feel like it was, right for their audience. The other one, though, it was absolutely, why would we ever do something that would benefit, Philly.com? That makes no sense to me. See you later, essentially.
Yeah.
So, I do have hope, actually, that next year we might be able to get one station on. They have a new managing editor. She seems really enthusiastic, so that may change. But I have seen certainly a difference in medium.
You look at Panama Papers. It's like one of the most successful collaborative journalism projects. And so many organizations of different sizes work together in that. It's so phenomenal how they all got something out of it. Of course, it served the public interest, but it also brought these small news organizations an opportunity to do meaningful work they couldn't have otherwise done.
And also grow their reporters' skill sets too. when they were especially collaborating on some of the data. I mean, we heard that when they were here earlier this year presenting at the summit. Yeah,
but that's the kind of project that almost by definition, it's sort of additive. You could just keep adding partners to that because anybody who gets access to a secret database with that much stuff, one, there's so much stuff in there that are you ever going to find it all? But two, for any additional partner, it doesn't take away from the other partner's audience.
Right.
You're all winning. And so it's not a zero-sum game to be part of a project like that. If you had the Snowden documents, you got to do Snowden coverage.
But the thing I also feel like talking to people who worked on the Panama Papers is like I don't want to use a gender. I would say a gentleman's agreement. It doesn't need to be gendered, but like just the agreement of like agreeing on the date of when they were going to actually start to release stories in the Panama Papers was a massive conversation involving different time zones and different people and egos, I'd imagine. And like, so, having people who can build consensus and be diplomats about what's the best for the project, you have to like give and take. I mean, we give and take too in working in partnerships all the time. We're not always going to get exactly what we want, but how do you figure out what is best for the project? And so it does take a certain mental approach of knowing you're going to give and get.
Yes, yeah. And sometimes a couple of the projects we've worked on in New Jersey, one partner will say, we're totally in, as long as that partner's not involved. So there is still like some competition for sure. Yeah. One of the things you mentioned when you were presenting the report earlier, Sarah, was talking about how specific topics, we talked a little bit about this with the Reentry Project, really seemed to spark interest in cooperation and collaboration. And many of those are investigative and accountability. So I know those are some things you've worked on. Bruce, what do you think? Why do you think those sorts of investigative stories like the Panama Papers or accountability stories tend to be more open to collaboration?
So I think, first of all, one, they're high impact. So people who want to work on and call these projects, because these are almost one-offs. These are in your category of sort of short term.
Yeah.
You want to be part of something big, and so something investigative fits. The other thing is, I think that organizations working together, everybody's bringing something different. So you're looking for different skill sets, and people want to be part of an NPR project a lot of times because we bring an audience. If you have this story and you want to team up with us, you know that you're going to get a huge audience, and so that's maybe the value we bring. Other partners in a project bring data skills, unique investigative skills that not every organization has. So, I know that a sort of global economy is sort of out of fashion these days. The idea that trade, everybody specializes, and a more efficient economy is based on the idea that you play to specialization. Well, that's kind of what this is about, is that a partnership works when everybody is bringing a unique skill. And ProPublica is a great example. I mean, what they can bring in terms of data sets and the analysis that goes with that dovetails with their partners in ways that makes it work.
Yeah. One of the things you talked about there was impact, and one of the things that we hear a lot, and we saw a lot in this research, and we hear a lot in New Jersey too, is what am I going to get out of it? What am I going to get out of it? And so how do you track metrics, and what's important to one organization is not important to another? How do we track success so that going forward, what are some of those things that you see?
I mean, I can briefly speak to Crosscheck, which was the collaborative journalism project that we did, Google News Lab, First Draft Coalition, AFP, and about 37 news organizations did around the French election a few months ago. And there were 63 stories that were debunked in that project. Everything from Macron, is he wearing an earpiece, and just rumors that were occurring on the internet. And so 63 stories were debunked and corrected and shared. But there's research that I think First Draft is working on right now that will come out that's looking at this exact question of, so we've done this, but what was the impact? Did French voters, were they impacted by the corrections? Did they see the corrections? So that's a question that we're really honed in on and supportive of figuring out, because we want to know impact for sure and figure out what techniques are working to better inform people in real time.
Can I ask you what what kind of data was collected as the project was going? What sort of metrics were collected or other data?
It's a good question. I don't know in detail, but I'm sure that
Claire knows.
Yeah, Claire knows
Okay.
everything. And yeah, she's probably
We'll ask
watching.
her.
Yeah, and I'm sure she's planning on talking a bit about it because I know she's on that and looking at impact. So
Something that came up a lot is that there's not yet a standard metric or set of metrics that collaborations have that are looking at. You know, there are people who are certainly keeping track, anecdotal evidence, but there does not seem yet to be any sort of standard metric or set of metrics to assess collaboration.
every project is different, right? Because
Yeah.
cross-check and election land specifically trying to debunk, the projects that you're doing are quite different. Documenting hate is very different. So
Yeah, it's
Yeah. And sometimes the partner news organizations involved want something more specific to them and their audience. That's what they want to know sometimes
Right.
too. Like, should I dedicate a reporter to another project? Well, what did it bring to me? Did it widen my audience? Did it widen my reach? Those are important questions too.
I mean, as Bruce said, collaborations are always a bit messy. There's always bumps in the road. And I can certainly say from my perspective, I think one of the things we didn't do so well at the outset was really clarifying what impact we wanted to have, what our specific mission was, not necessarily mission, but more specific impact that we wanted to come out with, and then, track towards that goal. It's something I'm thinking about as we move into year 2, being much more strategic in how we think about, what we want to come out of this with. And we're looking at it sort of twofold. One is internally, right? Journalistically, what impact are we having, can we have on the organizations that we work with? And then in the broader scheme, what impact can we have in the field of reentry or whatever our next topic is? And I think both of those, at least for our project, are equally important.
I think this whole question of measuring is really critical, because you can't go on the assumption that, oh, collaboration, that's a great thing. I mean, in and of itself, it's a means to an end, right? Like, so what's the end? What are you trying to accomplish? And there's a lot of different ways to think about it. You can think about it in terms of the journalism, and there are ways, and that all feels very soft, like, oh, we have better stories. Well, how do you know they're better stories? But you can break down, if you have definitions of quality, you can say, okay, we are doing a higher level of investigative work. We are doing more interviews with newsmakers that have impact. We are doing, higher quality enterprise type stories that other people don't have, that are unique. And so you can sort of measure it that way. You can measure things in terms of audience. So, for us, this is enormously important. But if you generate a network that actually reaches more people, you should see that more listeners are there. And industry wide, I think a lot of people's numbers are up, but that's something that's actually tangible and can be tracked. And so audience is a critical metric. And then another thing you can look at, from our point of view, is talent development. I mean, you have to be building the next generation of journalists. You have to be finding people who you might not have found otherwise. So you can track that. You can find out who are the good editors, who are the great reporters, and projects that force you to engage and work with these people and spot talent early and then track them over time. That's another way you can measure success. And I think the collaborative model works for all of those. It works for the journalism, it works for the audience, and it works for the talent and the journalists who are going to be coming up. And so I think there are ways that you can measure success, but you have to be really kind of rigorous about it.
That's a question we've been getting as we were doing the research, and also as we did the summit. How do we know whether we should do this? How do I, especially for folks who might be reporters or not the leadership, how do I sell this to my editor? And they're going to say, why should I do this?
Right.
And you need to be able to have, like, here's why it's going to.
Everything I'm doing is like, what's in it for me?
Yes, exactly.
And there has to be something. I mean, why do it if you're just using resources but just getting more of the same? There has to be something different.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And better.
Yep.
One of the things that I didn't really talk about in the talk just now, but that I talk about a lot in the report, is this sort of learning that happens in collaborations as well. So sort of intergenerational learning. intermedium learning, inter-newsroom learning.
Mhm.
And that seems to me to fit in this bucket of talent development, but also sort of workflow. I mean, I can see an entire newsroom benefiting from, I think you told a story, Jean, about an event that was pulled together really quickly, and another editor came and was like amazed that this small, scrappy newsroom had pulled together an event that had so many people so quickly, and it was like a workflow light bulb, right? So that's another metric, if that, but again, a squishy one, but
Yeah.
like somehow.
Well,
track that.
I would just add one little thing, which is that, and this is a cultural thing, but I notice it that I used to joke that in our newsroom, you could divide the newsroom into people who write on walls and people who don't. You know, that there is a sort of culture, and it's a younger culture, it's a digital culture, and I think that the collaborative effort dovetails a little bit with the sort of digital movement in that the sort of culture of an old newsroom, which was very top-down, hierarchical, big, powerful editor at the center telling everybody what to do, and reporters racing around trying to beat each other on stories, has given away a little bit to the kind of team, agile approach in which everybody's having little quick 15-minute stand-up meetings. And that kind of digital approach works really well with a collaborative model in terms of journalism, because it's all about, let's bring the 5 or 6 people together who have a stake in this story and figure out how we're going to work together, put together a team, go do it, and then do a rigorous after action and move on to the next thing. And I think it's not a coincidence that this is happening at the same time that a generation of people who are kind of digital natives are now in newsrooms and bringing that culture. And if you're in our newsroom now and you walk around, you've got people doing Facebook videos over here, and you've got people doing stand-up meetings over there. And 10 years ago, you wouldn't see anything like that. And again, it's like there's people who write on walls and brainstorm, and there's people who don't. And the people who do are coming up with fresher ways of thinking about doing this job.
I write on walls a lot.
Stephanie does write on walls a lot.
reputation for writing on walls. Yeah.
Huge Post-its everywhere.
I know. Speaking of workflow, we touched on earlier in resources. One of the questions that comes up a lot is, okay, we want to work together. How do we do that technically? What do we use? And I think, as Erica knows, probably most of our collaborations across the country are built within Google Docs and Google Drive. Probably that's, I would imagine, one of the most common methods that we use for collaboration in technology. But I was, curious to hear more from your perspective, Erica, on tools and tech, and also from Jean and Bruce on how, when you have organizations that are in different newsrooms, different CMSs, have different levels of skill. You're talking in Slack, you've got email, you've got your Google Drive, you've got this and that. How do you tie all that together? Anyone?
It's a good question. It's a big opportunity, really, to build the tools of the future. I think in election land, Slack was used in a big way. I think there were Slack channels for every 50 state. So there were catchers who were catching and finding things on social media or on Google Trends that were worth debunking. And then if it happened in Indiana, it was put in the Indiana Slack channel. There were people looking at that and taking it, verifying it, moving it to the next Slack channel. So Slack was a huge, huge part of that. Medan built a tool that was also used, a collaborative journalism tool. But yeah, people always go back to Google Docs and Google Sheets. And people use Google Docs because you can collaborate in them, and you can see track changes, and you can make comments, and it's just an easy way to communicate. I think we're still in an early phase of what tools are needed. I also just want to say there's the workflow tools, but then there's also the tools we built for documenting hate using the Google Cloud Natural Language Processing API, which is a totally new tool that's specifically looking at identifying information for journalists so that they can write stories. So there's the workflow tools, and then there's specialized tools that can help enable a project. And we definitely hack on both and try and figure out. And the great thing about election land and crosscheck is we got a lot of feedback about how Google Docs could be improved, and that wasn't something we necessarily went into looking for that feedback, but we got it, and that's great.
Yeah. And I'm curious how you've been managing that, Jean, in Philly, because you've got organizations that probably aren't tied together on any sort of tech platform at all.
In any way. And so, a lot of my job is just kind of managing. So within each partner outlet, there's normally one, sometimes two kind of people that I'm coordinating directly with. And I would have about 5 who are great at Slack, super easy, to communicate with them there, and we can coordinate in that way. There's some folks who respond much better to email. Some people I need to give a phone call if I want to get any response. So I see part of my job as the manager just figuring out how people communicate comfortably, and in a collaboration of our size, relinquishing the idea that we're all going to be on Slack all the time and it's just going to work for everyone. And so once I kind of gave that up, it became much simpler to say, all right, with this person I do this, with this person I do this. It's a little bit more time consuming, but so much of this work, at least I found in Philadelphia, it's about relationship building, right? I'm working with incredibly busy people who have a million other things to do every day other than what I want them to focus on. They're not my employees, they're essentially volunteers working on this project. And so I have to find a way to, communicate enough with them that they feel looped in and energized and enthusiastic about what we're doing, but not that it's a burden or it's overwhelming in any way. And everyone has a different kind of threshold for that. And I have to figure it out. And I think that's part of what keeps us moving forward.
Yep. When they're sharing content.
Well, I'm sorry, while you're answering Stephanie's next question, anyone who has a question in the audience?
Yes, we're going to go to the audience.
Be thinking about their question.
Yes, just a second.
Yeah.
Just a quick question following up on that. How do they share content?
So the way that we work is the Reentry Project has a central website, thereentryproject.org, which essentially we cull all of the stories relating to reentry that any of our partners produce. What we put on there is headline, picture, sort of a subheading, and then it links directly back out to the originating site. Because we didn't want to pull traffic away, right? We didn't want to just be reposting and having people only have eyes on our site. We wanted to direct traffic out. So that's one way that it's kind of shared. And then, Facebook, social, we put it all out that way. There are a couple of our members, Philly.com and Billy Penn, who have Reentry Project pages within their own website. So on that site, similarly, they have all of the reporting that they produce, but also their partners' reporting, which is cool. But same thing, linking back out to the original pages. In terms of the co-creation, we haven't done a lot of it, but we've certainly done some. I think we've had maybe, I don't know, between 5 and 10 kind of jointly reported stories. So that's when, a reporter from HYY takes a trip with a photographer from PMN to Lancaster County to do a story on why they have the lowest recidivism rate in Pennsylvania, right? And then he writes text for Philly.com. He does an audio piece for WHYY, and it kind of comes out together. So we've had several of those collaborations happen sort of cross newsroom.
Yep, yeah. And there definitely is technology being developed in this area. Like I think of Channel X out of Chicago. I think of Collective, Heather Bryant's project, Facet. Like there's definitely some work here. And in Europe, Hostwriter. There are others. So we have some questions, hopefully, in the audience.
I worked for a long time for CBS and particularly for network radio and broadcast and technical operations. So all of the things you're saying to me, I supported CBS News Network. And I keep thinking, because it's my native space, about the architecture behind the pieces you're presenting. So for instance, I know that, and this may be a little out of date, National Public Radio has this great situation where member stations upload to a file server. They can download anything from any other station. They can share anything they want. Typically, it's whole broadcasts. But is there any sort of that sort of service going on for your collaborative materials where it isn't just that you're sharing, and I don't mean dismissively just, but simply sharing information or approaches or concepts, or you do this piece and we'll do this piece. But really what you're actually sharing is a complete piece, an audio piece, a video piece, into some sort of shared architecture with cross permissions.
You guys are doing
well,
that, right?
I mean, the idea of being able to share the elements of the component parts before they become the finished piece is to me one of the things we have to figure out how to do. And since other people have already done it, my sense is that this is a fixable problem. But imagine the power, you know, across a network. And again, you said something that resonates with me, which is like I am not the boss of any of these member stations. You know? I have to ask nicely. And in the category of what's in it for them, well, one of the things that's what's in it for them and in it for us too, is the idea that all of this material is being created. People are interviewing people right and left, and then you use 12 seconds in a piece. Well, what about the other 20 minutes? I bet there was something good in it. And why not share that? And somebody else will find something of value in that. And that's at one level an editorial problem, and at another level it's a technical problem. And it's something that we are thinking about, because I think that it would make us much more powerful. And it's sort of a metaphor for the broader problem of a system that has knowledge in one part of the organization but not in another. And how do you break down those walls? And I think that that's one thing we have to try to do.
Hi, I'd be interested to hear some examples of the really successful collaborations where there's been, you know, like really something that would not have happened otherwise, you know, like great stories that would not have happened otherwise, or what kind of situations that it works best in. Because when I hear collaboration, I hear really long meetings where no one gets anything done. You know what I mean? So, and I'm sure that in your experience there have been things that were, you know, situations that haven't worked. But what really works? I mean, is there emerging something that that really fits the collaborative model?
Good question.
I mean, I think, obviously Panama Papers comes to mind. That's an extraordinary effort. But I think what we're finding works for us is like events-based, elections-based efforts, where there's going to be a larger perhaps amount of misinformation being shared, or disinformation. And people are going to inadvertently share things they don't on social media that they don't know is true or untrue. So that presents kind of a hyper-focused moment for journalists to work together to debunk things. So that's something we're focused on. I think event-based moments, election-based moments, and we could certainly expand, but we're seeing success right now there.
So I would say, well, first of all, we have one meeting per month, and it's an hour and a half long, and that's all I require. So it's not a ton of long meetings, though there's side conversations that happen. So for us, I would say, I think the answer is twofold. I mean, in terms of the reporting, you know, in the past 9 months or so, we've done probably close now to 150 stories on the issue of reentry in Philadelphia. And certainly some of those would have happened whether the collaborative existed or not. But I think one of the things, at least that I'm proud of the work that we've done, is we've really brought this issue that was just kind of simmering in the city to the surface. So I think the reporting has been great, just sort of the amount, and it's just put the issue sort of on the table in a way that it wasn't before. And I think we've, you know, again, this is like, it's squishy, it's anecdotal stuff, but I ran into a young woman recently who runs a project that works with people who are incarcerated as juveniles. And she said to me, she said, the Reentry Project has totally changed my perception of media and what it can be good for. And, you know, I think people have been impressed that we do take sort of social impact seriously, right? It's all of these news organizations saying we want to increase, you know, awareness about this really important issue. And I think she just felt like the stuff that she did that was always kind of sidelined was validated. In terms of right.
Sign up a reporter in Asia to do file on this, and you tie someone to interview.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, essentially, so from the sort of large perspective, we have an MOU that everyone kind of signs, although, as I said before, it's completely voluntary, and we haven't even looked at it since it was written. Essentially, each newsroom is kind of responsible for doing its own reporting, right? So often I will have ideas and I'll chat with some editors and they'll maybe assign reporters, but a lot of it is the reporters coming up with ideas on their own and doing their own reporting. So it's kind of just, it's just encouraging stuff that maybe would have happened before and pushing it a little bit farther. We all try to let each other know when stories are coming out. That doesn't always happen. There's often, reporting that comes out that I didn't know that story was coming out today. But when they can, editors let me know. But it is, the reporting itself really does happen, within the newsroom, kind of in its normal channels, with some prodding, I would say, from me in some cases. Nope. So that was talked about at the beginning. I feel like, maybe it's something that we could get to in the next iteration, but there isn't, unless it's kind of from the beginning established, WHYY reporter is going to work with the Inky reporter on this story. There isn't that back-end collaboration.
Are you going to jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
Really quickly, like on election land, so there were over 200 news organizations across America that were signed up to an email listserv, and also following the blog. So basically the idea was like when things were debunked or corrected, this was a service. It's almost like not a wire service, I mean, that's overstating it, but providing information directly to those newsrooms so that they had additional information to act on, to verify or to correct, or just to communicate with their communities. So that was one way, I think, on election land that we were trying to, and with Crosscheck, we were trying to make sure that stuff was spreading to provide service opportunities to other news organizations.
And let me take a run at this in a slightly different way, and to think about this, think about it as not a project. A project to me is like, oh, there's this thing you want to do, and you're going to pull together a team, and you're going to go do that one thing, and then the project's over. And what we're trying to do is actually create collaboration as the model for how you do what you do every day, ongoing. Okay, and they're different, and it's an important difference. And so then the question that you ask is, so are you getting anything better for having to talk to each other? And I'll give you a couple examples. One very straightforward, fairly recent. Texas created a statewide collaborative. Now the starting point is like, oh, it's all public radio stations, so they're all on the same team, except they're kind of not. I mean, that's the nature of the business, is that we're simultaneously, public media together, and we're competitors. And so you have 4 big markets down there: San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, and Houston. And the state legislature has a special session, and in the old model, 4 stations send 4 reporters, and in this year's iteration, the bathroom bill is the big thing. So everybody covers that. That would be the way you do it in the old model. And then everybody goes back because they're competitors, and in Dallas you hear the Dallas story, and in San Antonio you hear the San Antonio story, and you're all hearing the same topic, just 4 reporters doing it. What they did this time was basically say, hey, we're a statewide collaborative, so we're going to get together ahead of time. We know we have to do the bathroom bill, so you get that. But we're going to assign Dallas, you're going to do this aspect of it, and San Antonio, you're going to do that aspect, and so forth. And so now what happened was 4 reporters went, but 4 reporters did 4 different aspects of the story, dug a little deeper than they would have otherwise, shared the content on all the stations, and not just the 4, but statewide. So 26 Texas stations got the coverage. And now they got 4 times as much content for the same investment in resources. And that becomes the model going forward. So when the hurricane hits and Houston is overwhelmed and just trying to keep up with Houston, the group gets together, and I sat on this call. I was on the call as they planned it. And it's San Antonio, we're going to take Corpus, and Dallas, we're going to take this place. And all the affected communities were covered by stations not in those communities, and then the content was shared everywhere. That didn't happen a few years ago. And the community in Texas is better served for it.
That's such a good point.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point, because when you think of news events like that and how traditionally there'd be 6 reporters doing the same thing, all doing the same thing, going to end up producing a similar story in 6 different places. Now you can talk ahead of time and deploy them differently so that we go deeper and we get better stories. Like,
what it took was working together and then trusting that, oh, if you edit the story for my station, it'll be good.
Right.
And that, that's a leap of faith, but that comes from working together, getting to know each other, trusting, and then doing it again, and not just moving on to your next thing. And that's what we're doing. That's what's happening more and more.
If you were going to start a collaborative or cooperative news organization, newsroom or news network from the ground up, what would be some key foundational issues that you seek to address?
I think that would be easier than
Right.
foundational issue. I mean, I think you have. So one, you have to have a sort of common set of standards and ethics and practices. There has to be an agreement on like what is the right way to do stuff. What are the ethical standards? And then you have to have a sort of training regimen that ensures that people trust each other. I think that's almost foundational. What are the ethics of what we're trying to do, and what are our standards? Then I think we are big advocates right now of editors as an important aspect of the business, and NPR is very much a kind of production program culture. Morning Edition, All Things Considered. I mean, they're big. There's big gravitational pull there. And whereas newspapers have the kind of tradition of the strong editor, we talk a lot about how the role of the editor has changed dramatically. And so what we're talking about now are people who aren't just moving copy, but are really thinking big about coverage objectives. Like, what is the purpose? What is the mission we're trying to accomplish? In your project, you have a focus. What. For an organization like ours, which is doing broad national coverage, local coverage, regional coverage, there are more layers to that. But for any aspect of a collaborative project, there has to be a sort of a vision, and there has to be somebody who has the kind of unique skill set that allows you to sort of orchestrate, because the sort of role of the conductor is way more important than it probably used to be. And this is not. Oftentimes, again, if you're starting from scratch, would you have an organization that's more hierarchical? Maybe not. But in most cases, you have partners that have some interests that align and some interests that don't. And so you have to have somebody who can find the common ground. And I'm sure there's plenty more that we can talk about, but those are sort of a few things that come to mind.
They're actually, I mean, if you think about, ProPublica, the Marshall Project. I mean, there actually have been organizations that have begun as sort of with collaboration built into the DNA of what they do. And, they seem to be less hierarchical, though there are certainly project editors and project managers. I mean, it seems like that was one of the trends that emerged from the report, is that that's really a key component. It's having someone who is at least part of their time managing the collaboration and sort of taking care of all these sort of logistical and other issues that come up. But it's just sort of like a culture shift. I mean, I think that story you just told is so perfect. I mean, Jim Schachter told another anecdote that's in the report about how when he used to be a reporter in Florida and how much that's changed in a very similar way to what Bruce just described. It's like a culture shift. I mean, I would say that that's one of the foundational elements, is like having this mindset that we're going to collaborate and we're going to get more, and it's going to be good. Yeah.
I think for me, if I were to answer that question and think about what like a co-op newsroom looked like, or a collaborative project, I mean, we start with the technology, like what's needed, what resources have been reduced or stripped or defunded or underfunded inside of newsrooms that are critical to the creation of journalism, whether that is the most obvious things like, I don't know, time to go out and cover a story, research capabilities to find information, all the way down to like journalists going to, the Middle East, but not having insurance because they're going as freelancers and not as, part of CBS News. There's like a million things you could come up with in that chain of what it takes to create great journalism that I don't think all journalists and freelancers have access to. So I would probably think through like what the technology is. I mean, insurance is not a good example. It's not technology, but there's a lot of different ways in which I think tech companies could help by building the solutions that are needed to create journalism, whether you're creating it on 45th Avenue at the New York Times, or you're creating it out of your home as a freelancer somewhere in Latin America. So I think about it from a technology standpoint, which is there's a ton of opportunity to create shared resources for journalists.
And the report that we released today is focused on newsroom to newsroom collaboration. But one of the things that we want to get more into and look at in the future is other collaborations with libraries, collaborations with local citizens or civic groups, those sorts of things too, technology companies, because we see journalists, we're finally okay to work with each other. And we're getting there slowly. And working with other organizations too, I think would be important if you're building something from scratch and thinking outside our own bubble too. Mike's got a question.
Yeah, I think we have time for one.
Yeah, we could do 2 more for sure. Yeah.
Well, first, thanks for coming here. It's like really interesting to hear all your different perspectives. And my question is actually directly related to something that Stefanie just said, which was, I know that there's going to be interest in looking at collaborations outside of the newsroom, technology, civic technology, nonprofits, community organizations. And this question is really for Jean, but I think it's kind of for everyone, is what experiences have you had with community collaborations, especially with social justice organizations? Because I think that community newsroom collaborations are a natural outgrowth from community engagement. And so I was curious to know how you worked with community organizations in a way that wasn't simply extraction of information, but true collaboration.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. And I have 2 concrete examples. So we have a couple events coming up this fall. One is a hackathon. So we are planning that together with the Reentry Coalition, which is sort of the city agency that's an alliance of the 80-some service providers and on reentry, and also the City Office of Open Data and Technology, and Code for Philly. And so, from the beginning, we decided, we thought this might be a fun idea. We went, first to the coalition to say, what do you think of this? Is this interesting? Do you think there's a space or do you think it would be helpful to bring coders and technologists together with formerly incarcerated people to talk about what possible digital solutions there are to reentry? And they said yes. And so we've been moving forward with that. Just this past Monday, we had like a needs assessment meeting where we brought together kind of a small group of service providers, formerly incarcerated people, coders, and journalists to kind of talk through how the hackathon will look. So that's one example. Another is our kind of big event that we're planning on November 15th. It's going to be we're calling them sort of lightning talks. It's called the Reentry Blueprint, Stories and Solutions from the Formerly Incarcerated. And the idea is 6 kind of lightning talks or short TED-style presentations, all by formerly incarcerated people talking about solutions to reentry, right? So ideas that they have and have already put into practice and that are actually working in the community. And the way this came about was, we realized we wanted to do some big kind of wrap-up event. Technically, our current grant ends November 30th, and wanted to do something that was, seems obvious, but that's meaningful, that was beneficial and not just an event to have an event. So I started talking with, some of the folks in the community at activist organizations that I've formed relationships with over the last year and said, what would be helpful? And so we came up with this idea and have formed kind of a small working group where it's essentially me, our event coordinator that we've hired, and a handful of formerly incarcerated people who have become kind of leaders in this community. So just this week, we had to finalize the kind of logo and invitation for the event. And when I sent it out to the working group saying, what do you think of the design? One of the folks that we had been working with kind of called me on it and said, I think our logo should be on there, right? Because it had just said presented by the Reentry Project. And I realized he was totally right. We were, they were helping to plan this just as much as we were. So we put the couple of, logos from these community organizations on the event. It says presented by the Reentry Project in coordination with the Center for Returning Citizens and Frontline Dads. And I sent it to all the partners saying, look, you guys know, but I'm going to sort of reiterate the process that we've had in planning this event. Here's the logo. They've asked to be included on it. I think that's perfectly reasonable. Are you okay with this? And to be honest, I was a little bit nervous. I could have seen a couple of them saying, I'm not sure I want, us saying we're presenting with, these essentially activist organizations. Everyone responded to the email within an hour, which is, first of all, amazing. Second of all, saying, looks great, I'm fine with it, move ahead. So those are some of the ways I've tried to kind of mitigate that, because you're right, any community engagement, you are creating relationships, and journalism can, to a lot of people, feel incredibly imbalanced, where we, the journalists, are taking, and we don't necessarily give back. So that's how I've been approaching it.
Susan, you had a question?
Thanks for these perspectives. And when is that event?
November 15th.
In the evening or?
In the evening, yes, 6 to 8:30 at the Franklin Institute, which is sort of a big museum in Philadelphia.
It sounds
Very
wonderful.
cool.
So, Susan Hagen with Civic Story, we've just started a series of videos on Camden. Sarah, I might have missed it. There was too many roads being repaved. I'm sorry, I'm late. But have you just noticed in general a greater proclivity for collaboration among nonprofit groups or for-profit, or is it the same, or have you encountered plenty of mixed groups?
Right. We did notice that it was more among nonprofit and community-sponsored and public organizations. And after we noticed that, we reached out to a couple people to ask, what do you think's going on? Is it maybe my sample is imbalanced? Maybe this is something in the culture in the newsrooms. And so we spoke to Jim Schachter at WNYC. We spoke to Bill Keller, and we spoke to a couple other people. And it seems like there is I say sort of built into the DNA, but as a public-facing organization where you're constantly asking the public to interact with you via membership or via giving information, calling into talk shows and stuff like that. Jim Schachter felt like that was really important. Part of the reason why they had been more open to collaboration sort of at the beginning. And Bill Keller felt like it was, a combination of sort of just resource constraints on the part of the smaller organizations. And, sometimes they are the ones initially to gain more. So they would be more open to it. So yeah, we did notice that. We noticed that trend, and we noticed that, but thankfully, it seems to have become very mainstream now as well, for the larger organizations as well.
Yeah. Part of that's probably also too because funding comes into play a lot, which we didn't really get into.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which I did mention very briefly, funds so many of these collaborations at the beginning, or Knight Foundation or whomever, and they like to give money to nonprofits and community sponsors. Right. Exactly. Right. So.
Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Yes.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. And if you don't already have the report, collaborativejournalism.org is where the full report will be, all of our tip sheets, and we will continue to collect case studies, research, and we'll launch a database, hopefully early next year. Mm-hmm. We're just starting to build that now with collaborative projects so that you can sort and we can categorize and help collect projects around the world that are happening.
Thank you. Thanks again. Thanks, guys. Great. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. And for anyone who wants a tour of the building, we'll meet right outside. Christine, will you be able to take folks?
Christine will take people on a tour if you'd like to take a spin around the
She's
new building.
assistant director of the School of Communication and Media here. So she'll give us a quick tour.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes,
Thank
so
you.
nice to meet you.